Nothing is ever lost. Nothing is ever created. Is that really true? Year after year, many new things appear in our world. Innovations, discoveries, ideas, creations, even living species. On the opposite end of the spectrum, things also disappear. We inevitably seek a logical explanation for these disappearances. In some cases, the answer is far from obvious. The two Canadian Forces CF-100s were practically flying as one. The fighter planes were performing a routine mission just over the north shore of Lake Ontario. Suddenly, the head plane accelerated slightly, broke away from the second plane, and went into a cloud, where it disappeared. For a moment, the pilot of the second aircraft stared in amazement at the jet streak that ended abruptly. It was the only proof that an aircraft had been in flight near him a moment earlier. The voice of the air traffic controller at the Trenton base brought him back to reality. The controller had also seen the CF-100's blip disappear within a split second from the radar screen. He wanted to know what had happened. The Canadian Forces CF-100, with 2 men aboard, had apparently vanished into thin air, as if it had flown into another dimension.
En croire la littérature consacrée aux phénomènes étranges.
According to literature on strange phenomena, there are certain spots where planes, boats, and entire crews can disappear as if they'd never existed. Is this a legend, or is it true?
C'est possible.
Every year, the press reports a number of disappearances, which at first glance appear to be inexplicable. Upon investigation, most of the disappearances turn out to be crimes or voluntary disappearances, hoaxes orchestrated by individuals hoping to hide from debtors or an unwanted spouse. But above and beyond these cases, there are other disappearances, ones that defy logic and any rational explanation. Who hasn't heard of the famous Bermuda Triangle? That stretch of ocean lying between the Florida Keys, the Bermuda Islands, and Puerto Rico. Hundreds of mysterious and inexplicable disappearances within the Bermuda Triangle have been reported. The Canadian brig Arbutus is one of the ships lost in the triangle. The 385-ton ship set sail from Jamaica on January 1st, 1899, headed to New York, and was never seen again. According to Canadian author Hugh Cochrane, there are at least 14 other areas similar to the Bermuda Triangle. One of them lies over the Great Lakes, between Canada and the United States.
On December 22, 1977, Craig Carlisle, an American pilot with 6,000 flight hours, took off from the Oshawa Airport in Canada, headed to Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. The aircraft, a twin-engine Cessna, registration number N404SA, left the runway at 9 p.m. 15 minutes later, the aircraft vanished from the radar screens at the Toronto airport. For 2 days, the U.S. Coast Guard and a Canadian Army Rescue Unit fine-combed a 2,000-kilometer area without finding the slightest trace of the twin-engine craft.
In cases like this, investigators search for debris to solve the mystery. And at times the debris that they find only serves to deepen the mystery surrounding the circumstances of the disappearance. In August of 1884, while navigating about 48 kilometers off the port of Catalina, Newfoundland, gunner HMS Mallard crossed paths with the brig Resolven, which was wandering aimlessly and appeared to be abandoned. HMS Mallard pulled alongside the Resolven, and some of the men went aboard. The Resolven, a 143-ton ship, was completely deserted. Its 9 crew members had vanished into thin air.
The Resolven is one of these famous abandoned ships. It was discovered off the waters of Newfoundland, and no one could account for why it was mysteriously sailing crewlessly. Where'd the crew gone? Pirates? Plague? Something of the sort? It was never, no one to this day, we're 200 years later, no one to this day has come up with any explanation because there's no further evidence of this. The Resolven represents a very small part of the marine mysteries of Eastern Canada.
Lakes and oceans aren't the only spots where things mysteriously disappear.
In December 1900, an English supply ship docked at Aileen Moor, the largest of the Flannan Islands off the coast of Scotland. The ship was carrying men to relieve the 3 lighthouse keepers currently on duty. But when the supply ship arrived, the crew aboard was surprised to discover that the lighthouse keepers were nowhere to be seen. They had no way of leaving the island. They had simply disappeared. It is also said that during the Dardanelles campaign of 1915, a British battalion of more than 370 soldiers suddenly disappeared after entering a strange fog.
In November of 1980, Granger Taylor, a young man from Duncan, British Columbia, left a note for his parents. Dear Mother and Father, I have left to meet extraterrestrials who have invited me to a 42-month interstellar journey. Granger Taylor was never seen again. The phenomenon of mysterious disappearances is one of the most fascinating, perhaps because, unlike other strange occurrences, it leaves victims in its wake. When someone claims to have seen a UFO, a ghost, or a lake monster, we can always shrug our shoulders and tell ourselves that the person was suffering from a hallucination or had simply confused a plane for a flying saucer. We can't just shrug off mysterious disappearances. Hundreds of men and women have literally disappeared without a trace. On the other hand, are the disappearances really as mysterious as some would like us to believe? That's not very likely.
Throughout the ages, inexplicable disappearances have been the stuff of the imagination. In the Middle Ages, they were perceived as the work of the devil or the work of the fairies. Nowadays, enthusiasts of strange phenomena speak of these disappearances in terms of alien abductions or a vortex into another dimension. Perhaps the reason that mysterious disappearances raise so much interest is because the potential fate of the victims opens the door to the wildest speculations. They also sent us into a mental tug-of-war pitting the circumstances of the disappearance against the missing pieces of the puzzle. These situations bring out the Sherlock Holmes in all of us. Are all of the so-called unexplained disappearances really that inexplicable?
History shows that what the mind lacks in information, it makes up for in imagination. In 1968, the London Sunday Times announced that it was sponsoring an extraordinary sailing race, the Golden Globe. Participants had to sail around the world single-handed on the boat of their choice. The departure time was left at the discretion of the sailors, but everyone had to leave by midnight on October 31st. The winner would be the fastest one to sail around the globe and return to his port of departure.
On October 31st, around 3 p.m., 9 hours before the start time window closed, Donald Crowhurst, a 37-year-old sailor virtually unknown in the world of sailing races, departed from Port Teignmouth on the English Channel. His boat, the Teignmouth Electron, was a trimaran decked out with the latest electronic navigation equipment designed by Crowhurst himself. Weeks passed and Crowhurst made good time. On December 10th, he told race officials that he had traveled 243 miles in a single day, a new world record. Soon after that, he said that he had passed the Cape of Good Hope and was now crossing the Indian Ocean. It was a perilous journey, and many ships had been damaged. In the spring of 1969, Crowhurst radioed in to say that he had passed the challenging Cape Horn and was now crossing the Atlantic. In London, experts were surprised by the navigator's abilities. When he had pulled out of Port Teignmouth, everyone doubted that he would even last a month. And here he was on his way back home. In June, the leaders had to drop out of the race due to damages to their ships, leaving Crowhurst in the lead. His wife and 4 children were preparing to welcome home a hero, but Donald Crowhurst never arrived in Teignmouth. On July 10, 1969, cargo ship RMV Picardy came across the Teignmouth Electron off the coast of the Azores. The trimaran was adrift and most of the sails were lowered. Captain Richard Bach sent 4 of his men to check if everything was okay on board, but there was no one on the ship. They towed it to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic.
Back in London, news that the trimaran had been discovered with no one on board raised alarm. Everyone refused to believe that Crowhurst could have fallen overboard. So it happened. The press soon dubbed it the sea drama of the century. It became the subject of conversations everywhere. Had Crowhurst disappeared into another dimension? After all, the Azores Islands were very far from the mysterious Bermuda Triangle. Had he been the victim of a sea monster? Or perhaps he had been abducted by aliens. The solution was much simpler than that. When he searched the trimaran, Captain Richard Bach found 2 logbooks rather than 1. The first logbook carefully recorded the daily position of the trimaran. The second contained fictional positions, the ones reported by Crowhurst, positions that, in the eyes of the world, kept him in the race. It appears that Crowhurst never left the Atlantic Ocean. He spent 8 months at sea, going around in circles in the Atlantic Ocean, trying as best he could to stay clear of commercial routes. Crowhurst was hoping to fool the world. His plan was to return to port within a time frame that would put him in 3rd or 4th place. If he didn't come in first place, then people wouldn't be overly curious about his exploits. On the other hand, if he returned to port as one of the leaders, he might be able to convince investors to market the navigation equipment he was using on his trimaran. Unfortunately, Crowhurst moved into first place in spite of himself. When the leaders began to drop out, it wouldn't take long for his fake entries in the logbook to be discovered. So rather than face the shame, Donald Crowhurst decided to throw himself overboard. As incredible as that may seem. If the logbooks hadn't been discovered, Donald Crowhurst's disappearance would no doubt have remained a favorite for mystery lovers. But the real story is much more bitter. What if all mysterious disappearances were this easy? What if the mystery was simply a matter of not knowing the truth? So the disappearance of a single man to cover up a con is one thing. But how do you explain the multitude of mysterious disappearances that have occurred in the famous Bermuda Triangle? This zone has reportedly been the site of hundreds of unexplained disappearances. American author Charles Berlitz popularized the Bermuda Triangle in the early 1970s. Of course, Berlitz wasn't the first person to point out how many disappearances had occurred in the area. But his book, The Bermuda Triangle, sold 5 million copies and made the bestseller list. It is still considered to be required reading on the subject. Like all authors who've written on the subject, Berlitz points to the Flight 19 incident as the most significant.
On December 5, 1945, a squadron of 5 Avenger bombers took off from the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station. The squadron's mission was to fly due east, bomb an old hulk anchored off the coast of Florida, and return to base, a routine exercise. The first leg of the flight was executed flawlessly. Then, after destroying the target, flight leader Lieutenant Charles Taylor suggested to the other pilots that they extend their flight. What we need to understand is that it was only days away from Christmas, and they received a bonus at the end of the year based on the number of hours flown during the year. At the time, Flight 19 still had several hours of free time, so why not make constructive use of them? The second leg of the flight didn't go quite as well. At around 3:40 p.m., Taylor contacted the base to report that he was lost and his instruments weren't working properly. He added that he thought he was over the Keys, a group of islands at the southern tip of Florida. For hours, ground controllers tried to guide the squadron back to the station, but they were unsuccessful. At 7:15 p.m., Taylor advised the Port Everglades relay station that he was now flying due west. It was his last message. By then, the first rescue aircraft were already in the air. Though a strange twist of fate, or perhaps a mere coincidence, one of the aircraft, a Martin Mariner seaplane specially designed for missions out at sea, also disappeared. According to the Navy, the total number of losses that fatal December 5th, 1945 was 6 aircraft, 5 Avengers and 1 Martin Mariner, plus 27 crew members.
The next day, on December 6th, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard mobilized close to 100 aircraft and ships to comb through an area of more than 380,000 square miles. But their efforts were in vain. No trace was ever found of Flight 19 or the Martin Mariner aircrew who flew out to search for them. Aside from Flight 19, the list of planes and boats that have disappeared in this area of the Atlantic is really quite impressive. If we look at aircraft alone, 130 or so have disappeared since 1964. Better yet, Canadian researcher Hugh Cochrane claims that a mysterious triangle affects air and sea navigation in and around the Great Lakes. Known as the Marysburg Vortex, or the Great Lakes Triangle, the area is bounded by the cities of North Bay, Kingston, and Detroit.
The Marysburg Vortex is on our doorstep, and it's fascinating. It's a triangular-shaped formation of the St. Lawrence River at the point of the Thousand Islands. And Marysburg is right there, and it's a vortex, if you wish. It's water's issuing out, the spirits are issuing in. According to Hugh Cochrane, who's a Toronto journalist who's made this study his own in a book called Gateway to Oblivion. Now, if that isn't a real subject, or title, that is. And in his book, Cochrane says there is no explanation for the numbers of disappearances of vessels. strange anomalies of a magnetic nature and other cartographic features that are known to mariners. He said there's no accounting for this because this is a vile vortex. It's like the Bermuda Triangle.
The Great Lakes Triangle is an area where many UFOs have been seen, and many people have said to have disappeared mysteriously under unknown circumstances. One incident involved a jet which was flying over the lake, one particular lake, and disappeared. It simply vanished off the radar screen and never to be seen again. Cases like this build up a reputation that there's an area of mystery. And yet, statistically, there are probably no more disappearances there than there are in other areas of Canada. But because we have a reputation, it is a mysterious event. We can call it a mystery.
In 1966, a pilot flying along the south shore of Lake Erie suddenly saw his single-engine plane cloaked in a fog that came out of nowhere. The fog was so thick that he could no longer see the ground. He immediately contacted the Air Traffic Control Center in Cleveland, Ohio, to advise them of the situation. The pilot literally screamed into his microphone that he was no longer in control of the situation and that the equipment on his plane was no longer responding. At the exact same moment, air traffic controllers saw his plane disappear from their radar screens. The U.S. Coast Guard began sweeping a large area between Erie and Buffalo. The search went on for days, but no trace was found of the aircraft or the pilot.
What happened to Tom Walker was also strange. On November 8, 1977, Walker and two of his colleagues took off from the Toronto Island Airport, also known as the Toronto City Centre. Walker had been flying for 9 years. He set a course for Owen Sound, located 130 kilometers northwest of Toronto on the Georgian Bay. But the men never arrived at their destination. 2 days later, Tom Walker was found wandering along the edge of a highway just outside of Toronto. He was taken to the hospital, where he was treated for a broken ankle and multiple contusions. He said that the last thing he remembered was his plane suddenly being enveloped in a thick fog. After that, the rest was a blank. He had no idea what had happened to his two companions. Walker's plane and passengers were never found, an inexplicable mystery.
When a plane or a boat disappears out at sea, skeptics may say that currents like the Gulf Stream, for instance, could have carried away the debris. Nothing remains by the time rescue teams appear at the scene of the disappearance. But when it comes to Lake Ontario or Lake Huron, there are no such currents. So how can we explain those mysterious disappearances? How is it that nothing is ever found? No body, no debris. It's as if the victims are simply erased from the face of the earth. That's how experts speak of the greatest marine mystery of all time, the Mary Celeste. On December 4th, 1872, a Canadian rigger navigating along the coast of the Azore Islands pulled up alongside the Mary Celeste, a 32-meter-long brig. The men who climbed aboard were shocked to find that the Mary Celeste was completely deserted. For no apparent reason, the ship had been abandoned by its 10 crew members. Why?
The most famous marine mystery of all time is the mystery of the Mary Celeste, which was a brigantine which was built and launched from Harsborough, Nova Scotia, and was a jinxed or hoodoo ship right from the first. For instance, it almost sank when it was launched. It took months to get it back on keel and then into the waters, and it just had one problem after another. It was said at a later point that seamen avoided it like the plague. However, it had a crew, went off, it was launched from New York to heading for Gibraltar, and off the Azores was found by another ship to be crewless. Sort of in the mid-Atlantic, no crew. What had happened to its 16 or so crew members? There was an open log book that was there. No indication of what had happened. The cargo was sealed. Nothing had been removed. It wasn't piracy, anything of the sort. So the captain of the vessel who encountered the Mary Celeste towed it into port, Gibraltar. And the reason it's so well known today is this mystery, what happened to the crew. Nice captain and well-known crew members, but also who owned the salvage. So we have a well-documented account of various explanations for this, with the result that the insurance company that insured this had to pay over a large sum of money to reimburse the company because those who discovered the ships claimed the cargo. The insurance company exists to this day, and there's a room in New York that's called the Mary Celeste Room. What happened was it attracted the attention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who thought Mary Celeste is not a very interesting name, so he renamed it the Marie Celeste, which does have a kind of celestial sound to it.
Mystery lovers have come up with 1,000 theories on why the crew disappeared. They include mutiny, piracy, a sea monster, and more recently, aliens. Regardless of what the speculations may be, no one has ever seen the crew of the Mary Celeste since. The same is true for the crew of the Ghost Blimp.
On August 16, 1942, U.S. Navy airship L-8, piloted by Lieutenant DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adam, appeared over Daly City, a San Francisco suburb. The airship was whistling like a deflating balloon, and it was sagging in the middle, a strong indication that it had lost helium. The tether line was hanging from the Mammoth, and its propellers and engines were stopped. For a moment, L-8 hung motionless over the main street. The gondola brushed a rooftop, then ran into electrical wires and came crashing down into the street. Police and firefighters who were the first to arrive on the scene cut through the blimp's envelope and made their way into the cabin. It was empty. The door was wide open, the engine and radio were in the on position, and nothing was missing inside the ship. What had happened? Where was the crew? Officers Cody and Adam were never seen again. The mystery surrounding their disappearance ranks up there with the disappearance of the crew of the Mary Celeste.
Whether it be the disappearance of Flight 19 or the crew of the Mary Celeste, every one of these odd incidents is officially investigated. Are we to believe that the experts investigating them were just as mystified as everybody? Not exactly. Arthur C. Clarke, author of the legendary 2001: A Space Odyssey, used to say that stories about planes and boats disappearing in the Bermuda Triangle could generally be explained quite easily once you examined the source of the stories. They usually turned out to be merely common tragedies. He would also say that it was thanks to the excellent work of the Florida Coast Guard that there were so few disappearances in this high-traffic zone, filled with amateur boaters and pilots who attempted to cross it without sufficient preparation. If we take a closer look at books written about the Bermuda Triangle, we find an incredible number of inaccuracies that only serve to deepen the mystery and make the disappearances seem even more inexplicable. In his unforgettable book, Charles Berlitz goes into detail about the crew members of Flight 19. He mentions their leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, had previously flown at least 2,500 hours. The competency of the pilots and navigators could not be doubted, insists the author. Berlitz also states that weather conditions were ideal for such a mission. And that's where he strays from the truth.
Probably the most famous report in the Bermuda Triangle is, however, I think, one of the true mysteries of the world. And that is that Flight 19 got lost and was never seen again. I mean, they haven't really been found since. They have found a lot of these types of planes under the Bermuda Triangle, in the sea, but in fact they were used for bombing raids and things, so they haven't found those planes. Effectively, a flight of planes went out, seems to have got lost. They were in contact all the time with their base. They said we can't. They were describing that the sea looked wrong, the sky looked wrong. They were changing direction here, changing direction there. They were never seen again. They were an inexperienced crew, although their leader was an experienced trainer and should have been able to get them back to base safely. It's possible that they could have just got lost and eventually run out of fuel and dropped in the sea. And were that the only part of the mystery, that would be enough. But what then happened was that, having created a fuss in the first place, they then sent out a very experienced rescue crew in a Mariner flying boat to go and find them. And that never came back either. That almost certainly exploded and was destroyed. And that, I think, is a coincidence too far. That really does need some more explanation. One possibility being, of course, that there was some huge, genuine electromagnetic surge that was messing up all their compasses, etc., and eventually even triggered the gas tanks of the Martin Mariner, which was known to be a bit unstable in terms of its safety and so on. But that means that there was an unusual discharge of something going on in the triangle. And that, for me, means that whatever the statistics on the triangle are, and I actually don't think the triangle is quite the mystery it's made out to be in that way, but there is something strange happened then, has happened on a few other occasions in the triangle, and it may be that there is something really, some kind of, maybe a meteorite under there or something in that area which actually does have an effect occasionally.
Apart from Charles Taylor, all of the men who flew under Flight 19 were young, inexperienced pilots. Taylor was a veteran, that's true, but he had just recently transferred to the base in Fort Lauderdale and was unfamiliar with the local geography. Flight conditions may have been ideal when the aircraft left the ground, but a major storm system was developing west of Florida. On the evening of December 5th, 1945, search and rescue operations were seriously hindered by rain and strong winds. But that doesn't explain everything. Based solely on statistics, the Bermuda Triangle is hardly any more mysterious than any other piece of ocean in the world. In 1975, a representative of Lloyd's of London, insurance broker for most merchant ships, showed that, according to official records, 428 boats had disappeared around the world since 1955. And nothing justified the belief that disappearances happen more frequently in the Bermuda Triangle than anywhere else.
The first thing to know, I mean, it has been studied by many people. In fact, almost my namesake originally, a chap called John Wallace Spencer, known relation of mine, studied it a great deal. And if you like, the sceptical side studied by a chap called Lawrence David Couche, who brought a book out on this as well. And the one thing that does become apparent is that the Bermuda Triangle, if it's nothing else, is also a statistical blip. There are more planes and boats running around in that area, and there is undoubtedly losses because there are inexperienced people with boats. It's a millionaire's playground. The Coast Guards have reported people trying to run around with world atlases when they should have very detailed maps because they can come to harm with shifting sandbanks and so on. Plus, you have a high incident of drug running and so on, where ships are captured and then sunk afterwards, etc. So the Bermuda Triangle may not be any more special in terms of the amount of planes and losses than anywhere else.
Oceanic areas like the Bermuda Triangle or the Devil's Triangle off the coast of Japan are known to have unpredictable weather conditions. Every year, meteorologists track the development of tropical storms that hit the eastern coast of the United States, the Caribbean, coastal areas of the Gulf of Mexico, and the Yucatan Peninsula. All of these tropical storms passed through the Bermuda Triangle. The disappearance of the crew of the Mary Celeste does not stand up to close scrutiny either.
The Mary Celeste was carrying a cargo of 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. It is now believed that Captain Briggs, who was unfamiliar with this type of cargo, forgot to ventilate the hold. Without such a precaution, the barrels would overheat and give off explosive fumes, and that's probably what happened. As they sailed through the tropics, the heat caused a buildup of vapor in the hold of the Mary Celeste that, under pressure, blew the hold doors wide open like a cork in a bottle of champagne. The fumes spread throughout the entire ship, rendering it uninhabitable. Faced with the urgency of the situation, Captain Briggs probably ordered everyone into the lifeboat attached to the Mary Celeste by a tow line. The idea was to distance the crew from the ship while the hold was being ventilated. But the tow line from the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste no doubt broke or became undone. The sails were still hoisted, so the ship drifted away too quickly for the crew to catch up. Lost at sea in the middle of the Atlantic, the crew didn't stand a chance of survival.
As for the disappearance of the crew of the L8, it can also be explained without involving the supernatural. The U.S. Navy investigation indicated that the airship had taken off at 7 a.m. on the morning of August 16, 1942. The L8 was loaded with depth charges that the crew could drop to sink enemy submarines. At 7:38, Lieutenant Cody told the base that he was east of the Farallon Islands and was about to investigate an oil slick. He never made contact again after that. It is believed that Charles Ellis Adams, who was on his first flight on this type of airship, threw a smoke bomb through the open door. This dangerous move caused the balloon to move unexpectedly. The theory is that the inexperienced officer lost his footing, and Cody, in his desire to help out his colleague, only made the angle worse. The two men fell through the open door. Freed from the weight of the crew, the blimp continued to rise until changes in air pressure caused a relief valve to open and the airship dropped back down. Nothing proves that these scenarios are accurate, but they do help to answer the questions based on what was observed. On December 26, 1900, the Hesperus docked at Eilean Mor, the largest of Scotland's flattened islands. What the men aboard the Hesperus found left them completely perplexed. The three men in charge of maintaining the lighthouse, the only structure on the island, had simply disappeared.
A thorough inspection of the buildings attached to the 23-meter high tower didn't reveal anything abnormal. Searchers did, however, find an overturned chair in the living room. And in the den, the cold ashes and old pieces of paper indicated that a fire had not been lit for several days. They found something unusual in the lighthouse daily log. In the last entry, dated December 13th, Thomas Marshall, one of the missing men, reported a series of strange occurrences. There had been violent storms that only hit Eilean Mor. Marshall also mentioned the low morale of his two companions. The men on Eilean Mor were never seen again. What happened to them? Did one of the lighthouse keepers go mad? Did he kill the other two before killing himself? After all, didn't the log entry mention the depressed state of the men? Perhaps they had been attacked by pirates or by a sea monster. All of these speculations were possible.
On August 12, 1915, Sir Ian Hamilton ordered his troops, the 5th Regiment of Norfolk, to attack Hill 60, which was 2.5 kilometers from Mount Chinook Bear. This was in the midst of the Battle of Gallipoli in Italy, and Allied forces were hoping to take control of the Sea of Marmara in Turkey, thereby wiping out the Ottoman Empire. A fog hung over the hill. Despite the fog, the soldiers, mostly British, continued to advance, resolute in their mission. An hour later, the wind began to blow and the fog dispersed. On Hill 60, not a soul was to be seen. The 5th Regiment of Norfolk, close to 380 men, had disappeared.
In Canada, there's a fascinating story about Lake Anjukuni, which is in the north, what is now Nunavut, on the border towards the Northwest Territories. And the story was that a trapper had come upon this village of several thousand people, according to some reports, that was there one day and was gone. In fact, when he came, the entire village was disappeared. There were still some pots on the fires with food in it. Some of the very valuable hunting artifacts and rifles were left behind, and no sign of the individuals. And the story carried on through tradition and retelling, and it seemed as though the aliens themselves had taken away an entire village of Aboriginal people.
The disappearance of 2 or 3 men may not seem to be that extraordinary. After all, an accident is always possible. But an entire battalion of 380 men? An entire town of 2,000 people? You can hardly blame those on bad weather or unfortunate circumstances. In cases like those, it's hard not to believe that something supernatural may have occurred.
Now, upon investigation, the RCMP at the time discovered there are many holes in the story. In that there was no village of anywhere near that size at the time. There were some stories and versions of the story in which the graves themselves of the individuals were dug up and vanished. Well, anyone who knows something about the North knows that there were no such things as those graves at the time. And because there were so many inconsistencies, upon investigation, it found out that the story was simply told and published in a newspaper as a fanciful imagination. It was science fiction. And yet, even to this day, there are questions to the RCMP about what happened to the village of Lake Anjukuni. Perhaps it was mysteriously taken away by the aliens themselves, even though it was proven wrong many, many years ago.
The weakest aspect of books written on strange phenomena is the inaccuracy of the facts reported. Some disappearances should never have been classified as inexplicable in the first place. Such is the case for the 5th Regiment of Norfolk. If we check the archives of the British Ministry of Defence, we see that the missing soldiers were in fact found. The bodies of at least 122 of the soldiers were discovered at the bottom of a ravine, less than 800 meters from enemy lines. The men had been ambushed by the Turkish army, who lie in wait in the woods on the other side of the legendary Hill 60. As for the survivors, they simply joined up with other British battalions in the theater of operations. This is not the only mistaken case of a mysterious disappearance. The disappearance of the Eileen Moore lighthouse keepers can also be explained without having to resort to the supernatural. In 1901, the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that a huge wave had carried the men away while they were working on the crane platform. The report adds that the platform was 35 meters off the ground, and the men had no chance to climb off of it. The 3 lighthouse keepers were swept into the sea with no chance of setting foot back on the island. Referring to the incident as unusual is one thing, but saying that it's inexplicable is another.
When it comes to mysterious disappearances, there are countless incredible stories. Unfortunately, a thorough examination of the facts often reveals that the incidents are not exactly inexplicable. When they are presented as a whole, these disappearances seem to offer no solution. That is, if you are looking for one simple explanation to account for all of them. But taken individually, each one holds the key to a rational possibility. And in the investigative field, a rational theory always beats a supernatural theory. So far, none of the mysterious disappearances force us to accept that there are portals to another dimension. Rather than using qualifiers such as unexplained or inexplicable, perhaps we should start speaking of disappearances in terms of lacking sufficient details, since that is exactly what it boils down to.
There are always disappearances that leave us puzzled.
l'idée de disparaître.
The idea of disappearing, being erased from the face of the earth, is a disturbing thought. And it's our underlying anxiety that draws us to mysteries like the Bermuda Triangle, the Marysburg Vortex, or the adventures of the Mary Celeste.
Marie Céleste.
Just like parasites, these mysteries feed on our fear and ignorance.